Thank you for having me in this conference. The name of this presentation is In the Name of Culture and Religion, the Political Function of Blasphemy in Islamic States. The main argument is that blasphemy laws and a cultural relativist approach to human rights have a political function in authoritarian states. Islamic states are no exception. Islamic states very often use a strong cultural relativist approach to justify their dismal human rights record. And the main aim of this approach, however, is survival. So the article, or this presentation, shows how Islamic countries use religion for their own political survival purposes and how blasphemy laws are often used to silence critique of political, social, and religious orders that infringe on basic human rights. So, from this perspective, blasphemy laws are tools of oppression, not a symbol of culture and religious difference. And by highlighting how blasphemy laws and cultural relativist approach to religion have been used as tools of oppression by authoritarian regimes, the presentation underscores the importance of freedom of expression for any functioning society. I will first start with an incident that took place after the Charlie Hebdo massacre. One day after the Charlie Hebdo attack on the 7th of January 2015, Saudi Arabia released a statement through its official news agency condemning the massacre, calling it a cowardly terrorist act, incompatible with Islam. Then it sent its ambassador to Paris on 11th of January to join more than 50 world leaders and 3 million persons marching in solidarity with Charlie Hebdo and in defense of freedom of expression. Yet 2 days after the massacre, this very government pulled the Saudi blogger Raif Badawi from his jail cell in Jeddah, brought him to a square in front of Al-Jafali Mosque, and administered the first phase, 50 lashes of a public flogging. Badawi was guilty, as described by his indictment, of insulting Islam, producing what would disturb public order, religious values, and morals. Reacting to the international outcry that followed Badawi's flogging, the Saudi Foreign Ministry issued a statement in March expressing its intense surprise and dismay at what is being reported by some media about the case of citizen Raif Badawi and his sentence. It then defended its record on human rights, saying that the Kingdom Constitution ensured the protection of human rights because it was based on Islamic Sharia law. Now, this double talk, and it is double talk, defending a certain right on an international stage and violating it within a country's own borders is not limited to Saudi Arabia. One has only to see the names of some of the 50 leaders who joined the French president in the Unity March of 11th January 2015. What is relevant from the perspective of this presentation, however, is the manner in which these states often use religion, culture, and blasphemy laws to justify their authoritarian grip on power and violating human rights with impunity. Cultural relativism has been used to justify human rights violations in authoritarian countries. Islamic states are no exception. There are two types of cultural relativism, a strong and a weak type. The strong cultural relativists hold that culture is the principal source of the validity of a moral right or rule. The presumption is that rights and other social practice, value, and moral rules are culturally determined. So culture determines what we understand as justice, as rights. The weak culture relativists, on the other hand, assert that culture may be an important source of the validity of a moral right or rule. Universality is initially presumed, but the relativity of human nature, communities, and rights serve as a check on potential excesses of universalism. Strong cultural relativism has been used repeatedly by Islamic states to stop criticism of their violations of citizenship rights, women rights, minority rights, and LGBT rights. The double standard and the political function of a cultural relativist approach to human rights highlight the importance of safeguarding freedom of expression, not curtailing it. This political function pinpoints the argument of this presentation. Without freedom of expression, there is no freedom at all. Think of all the authoritarian and theocratic states in the world. The one thing they have in common, in addition to their human rights violation, is the absence of freedom of expression. In the case of Islamic states, religion and culture have often been used as a useful card. I'm saying it's a useful card for political survival tactics. So what I will do right now is basically, I will first highlight how authoritarian states use a cultural relativist approach to human rights. And then afterwards, I will highlight how Islamic countries use religion for their own political survival purposes, and how blasphemy laws are often used to silence criticism of religion, social and political orders that infringe on basic human rights. I repeat, from the perspective of this presentation, blasphemy laws are tools of oppression, not a symbol of culture and religious difference. Talking about cultural relativism, I think it would be good to start with United Nations Human Rights Council resolution. A resolution that was passed in this council, the Human Rights Council, in March 2011. That resolution was spearheaded by Russia. It called for promoting human rights and fundamental freedoms through a better understanding, notice, a better understanding of what? Of traditional values of mankind. It demands a survey of best traditional practices and declares that all cultures and civilizations in their traditions, customs, religions, and beliefs share a common set of values. The significance of this resolution was not lost on Human Rights Watch. In fact, it prefaced its 2013 Human Rights Report with an article titled "The Trouble with Tradition, When Values Trample Over Rights." It warns of the dangers of invoking, quote, "a single supposedly agreed upon value system that steamrolls over diversity, ignores the dynamic nature of traditional practices and customary laws." Significantly, the article argues traditional values can be corrupted, serving as a handy tool for governments in the business of repression, and simply put, tradition, culture, and religion have been used to undermine human rights and authoritarian regimes. And examples are plentiful. Consider Iran. It has often used a discourse of cultural relativism on human rights in its relationships with international human rights bodies, and has asserted the right to cultural exceptionalism, invoking authentic cultural and religious justifications for its shameful human rights record. Now, very often, its argument will go in a manner that will insist, as one statement of the Iranian government that was issued in 1995 states that if a government establishes limitation on its citizens for the sake of the protection of public morality, it will be questioned and blamed in the UN resolutions. And from this perspective, Iran considers that the Commission on Human Rights and other UN organs give no consideration to religious values. And from its perspective, it can even be said that they take place under various excuses, a kind of struggle against religious values and beliefs. Now, Iran may claim it protects public morality and correct religious values, but Afshari, who documented Iran's discourse on human rights and his actual record of violations in his authoritative study, Human Rights in Iran, the Abuse of Cultural Relativism, his book has shown convincingly that the issue is not about Islam as a private faith of individual, but what state officials claiming Islam authority might have to say about the state's treatment of citizens. So when he researched Iranian government documents, human rights records, and archives of the United Nations, he provided us with ample evidence that Iran has behaved as a remarkably authoritarian government in its human rights abuses. It has systematically jailed, tortured, and executed dissidents without due process of law and assassinated political opponents outside state borders, and has often defended these acts as authentic cultural practices. The phrases authentic cultural practices and correct religious values sound quite hollow in the face of the persecution endured by Iran's Baha'i minority. It's the largest non-Muslim minority in Iran. And since they are not recognized in Iran and hence do not exist officially, estimates of their numbers vary from 150,000 to 500,000. Now, the Baha'i religion, a monotheistic faith, originated in Shiraz in 1840, but it is deemed in Iran to be a false revelation, and its followers are treated as apostates. They are persecuted in a way that aims to destroy the condition they need to survive as a community. Individuals are attacked on all possible grounds and in all spheres of public life. Oppression includes execution, torture, arbitrary imprisonment, denial of education and employment, arbitrary seizure of homes and possessions, confiscation of community assets, desecration and destruction of holy places. The whole or the goal of the harassment and persecution is to get Baha'i to convert to Islam. One revealing document is an official letter sent by an Iranian authority to a Baha'i who was denied his pension after the Islamic Revolution. That letter told him, based on the information received, you are Baha'i and therefore not entitled to a pension payment. However, should you convert to Islam and demonstrate remorse for having been a Baha'i and further provide this office with proof that you have embraced Islam, step will be taken to restore pension payments to you. Certainly no one can justify depriving a citizen of his or her pension with the argument that doing so will protect public morality and authentic religious values. Leaving Iran, moving to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is another regime that uses religion as a tool to justify any policy the government chooses to follow, a tool of legitimization that is hardly original. For example, the Saudi authorities have cited religious teachings and cultural norms to deny women and girls the right to participate in sport activities. One religious leader called them steps of the devil on the path to immortality. Now, this violation of a girl's right was cited in the 2013 Human Rights Watch report. But thanks to both international and internal pressure, the policy changed in April 2014. Suddenly, after decades of insistence that Islamic teachings prohibit sport for girls, those teachings miraculously changed. The government cited a religious edict by a dead mufti to justify its change of course. While the new policy is to be applauded, this example clearly illuminates how religion and cultures are indeed utilized as tools of justification. By the same token, the Saudi authorities have often invoked religion to silence political criticism of their authoritarian style of governance. The apostasy case mentioned in the introduction against Saudi blogger and intellectual Raif Badawi is a famous example. In 26, he created the Saudi Liberal Network, a platform for a serious discussion of liberal ideas, religious authorities, and the Wahhabi interpretation of Islam in the kingdom. As a result, he was imprisoned in June 2012 and is serving a 10-year sentence, which also include 1,000 lashes, a fine of $266,000, and a ban on traveling and expressing himself in the media for 10 years after his release. That means after he finishes his 10-year sentence. He was accused of apostasy, and using the words of the Jeddah Criminal Court, was found guilty of producing what would disturb public order, religious values, and morals, facilitating, quote, sin, aggression, and insulting Muslim sanctities, in addition to ridiculing Islamic religious figures. Note that Badawi never renounced his religion, although that is a right. For choosing or not choosing one's religion is a fundamental human right. But the issue here goes beyond the violation of these rights. It's the strategy of the Saudi authority to accuse any any person who dares to criticize, to accuse that person of apostasy as a way to delegitimize him or her. Amnesty International called his sentence outrageous and described him as a prisoner of conscience, guilty of nothing more than daring to create a public forum for discussion and peacefully exercising the right to freedom of expression. And for that, he is in prison. Nowadays, countries like Iran and Saudi Arabia turn to traditional values, culture, and religion to justify their human rights abuses and oppression. Now, it might come as a surprise that in the mid-20th century, it was the colonial powers that used this strategy of cultural relativism to deny that human rights are universal. And as in Iran and Saudi Arabia, as they do today, the colonial power used to justify violating the rights of the citizens in their colonies using cultural relativism. Indeed, in the early 1950s, cultural relativism was mainly driven by the imperial powers and was strongly opposed by the delegates of the few developing countries then included in the United Nations. So it's the exact opposite of what academic proponents of cultural relativism hold as orthodoxy. Universal human rights are not an imposition of hegemonic imperial countries. In fact, the fact has been researched and documented by Burke and shown in his book, where he wrote, in the opening years of the 1950s, cultural relativism was the language of the Western colonial powers, which resisted any attempt to extend human rights to their colonies. Diplomats from Great Britain, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands explained to the UN Third Committee why particular human rights treaties could not be applied to the colonies under their control. A Nobel laureate, Casson, exemplified this tendency when he complained during a 1950 debate on human rights covenants that it would be improper to subject countries inhabited by different peoples to uniform obligations, especially those at the lowest stage of development. And as the Belgian representative protested in October 1950, human rights, he said, were for advanced civilized countries, not for Africans. So Western colonial delegations attempted to evade their human rights obligations through a fine reverence for the traditional culture of indigenous inhabitants. All of this was done in, like Iran and Saudi Arabia, done in the name of, actually in order to protect their own survival in these colonies. This brings me to the politics of survivor and the Islamist card. The politics of survivor and the Islamist cards are concepts that are introduced in the Arab States and Women's Rights, The Trap of Authoritarian Governance. That is a book that was published in 2011, and it was based on field research that are conducted in several countries, including Yemen, Kuwait, and Syria. In that book, I argued that due to the lack of legitimacy of Arab states, they often engage in the politics of survivor. And this requires the use of several tactics, one of which is the Islamist card. And this utilization of Islamism and religion has a significant relevance to this article. Blasphemy laws are used in Islamic countries to justify a social and political order that often violates, with impunity, equal human and citizenship rights. I will explain in the following section the concept of politics of survivor and the Islamist card. Lack of legitimacy, as I said before, is the primary weakness of Arab states. Ruling elites recognize this deficiency as the Achilles heel that threatens the stability of their regimes. A natural outcome of this deficiency is their dependence on their traditional and clientel power base. The combination of these two is what compels these elites to continuously engage in the politics of survivor. The term of politics of survivor was first introduced by Joel Migdal, and he did that actually in 1989. I used it in several in my research and later in this book, The Arab State and Women's Rights, The Trap of Authoritarian Governance. And I'm using it here to indicate a state leader or regimes shifting alliances with various political and social groups and their allocation and channeling of resources to these groups to ensure their hold on power and to survive in a hostile regional environment. In other words, it's a kind of a strategy where you basically work together with specific groups, you share with them certain resources, and the aim of which is basically to hold in power and to survive. In other words, and in a Machiavellian sense, this means undertaking whatever it takes, whatever is necessary to survive in the shifting sands of politics. The state leader or regime is expected to juggle in tandem different and sometimes competing interests and simultaneously to direct these strategies to the ultimate aim of this policy or politics, staying in power. To achieve this end, the state leader or the regime resort to various kinds of action that are characteristic of the politics of survivor. The one that concerns us here in this presentation is the Islamist card. In playing the Islamist card, the state leader or the regime takes advantage of the phenomenon of what I call societal and political Islamism. Before elaborating on this point further, a definition of the two types of Islamism is warranted because we face these two types of Islamism in today's world. Societal Islamism refers to modern fundamentalist religious movements, such as the Salafi and Deobandi movements, which concerns themselves with changing social behaviors on the basis of their rigid worldviews. They call for an Islamic mode of life, separate their followers from the wider society, and refrain from political engagement, very often. This type focuses on behavior, insisting on strict adherence to a range of ritual and personal behavior practices, especially worship, dress, and everyday conduct. And when they start with women, because the first thing they insist on that these women should cover themselves. In short, these movements insist on implementing the Sharia as they interpret it in a strict and a literal manner. However, unlike political Islamist movements, they lack a systematic political ideology and are not concerned with state building, at least not on this stage. Political Islamism, on the other hand, is an ideology, a modern ideology that seeks to use the state's political power as a means of changing and transforming existing societies. It's very totalitarian in nature, and the aim is the creation of a theocratic state. Power is only a means to an end. Its goal is a revolutionary change, as I said. Its aim is the creation of a society and a state, a society that is governed by God's law. And it envisions a state where identity and citizenship are based on and defined by religious affiliation and observance. Your citizenship is decided by your belief. Now imagine what that means in a society. For those who don't believe, for those who have what you might call a different belief. Consequently, universal human rights, citizenship rights, minority and women's rights are often violated. There are two main political movements that embody the ideology of political Islam. From these two sprang other groups, both violent and non-violent. The two are the Muslim Brotherhood, created in Egypt in 1928 by Hassan al-Banna. He was a primary school teacher. And the Jama'ah al-Islamiyya, created in British India in 1941 by Abu al-Ala al-Mawdudi, an Indian-born journalist who later moved to Pakistan. Now, making this distinction between the two types, societal and political Islamism, does not mean to imply that societal Islamist movements do not share the agenda of political Islamism. They do share it. Their worldview embraces the ultimate objective of creating an Islamist state that implements what they consider the laws of God, and they actively promote concepts of military and missionary jihad. The two types also share a belief in the supremacy of Muslims and Islam, and a narration of history that portrays Muslims and Islam as perpetual victims subject to hegemonic attacks and persecution. Historical facts, self-criticism are conspicuously absent in such recollections. According to this narrative, the world is divided into two camps, us and them. The West, which is considered as them, the other, is presented as homogeneous and certainly the enemy, intent on destroying Islam and Islamic values and cultures. Now, these Islamist movements are major players in the Islamist card strategy of many Islamist regimes. Please remember, I was talking about the politics of survival. I said that Islamic states very often engage in this politics of survival, and part of that politics of survival is the utilization of an Islamist card, and these Islamist movements and their two versions, the fundamentalist and the political versions of Islamist or Islamism, they are very much important players in this strategy of these regimes. So, state leaders and regimes endorse certain Islamic groups rather than others and forge political alliances with them. The main aim of this strategy is political, to deploy the support of these Islamist groups as a means of legitimizing their rule in a religious sense and or delegitimizing that of their rivals. The tactics is also instrumental in undermining rival Islamist groups that pose a real challenge to the state leadership, and sidelining or even gaining the reluctant support of other political groups that fear the rise of political and societal Islamism in their society. And here, the leader, the regime, they deliberately take advantage of fear. This may be a fear of Islamic fundamentalism, its intolerance of non-Muslim, non-Sunni, non-Shia groups, or fear of the tyranny of a theocratic rule, or fear of being branded as anti-Islamic. And this strategy may have been useful for the legitimacy of the regime, but it necessitates the use of laws that curtail fundamental human rights, including blasphemy laws. The aim here is to control social behavior in a manner that supports the established political discourse of the regime and the religious interpretation of their allies in the religious establishment. I'm coming to a conclusion here. Every time Islamists attack journalists, filmmakers, or cartoonists in European and North American countries, a discourse of cultural relativism starts. It considers any exercise of the freedom of expression, however offensive it may be, a breach of culture sensitivity or worse, Islamophobic. The discourse of cultural relativism calls on these intellectuals to apply restraint and stop offending the feelings of a religious group. Yet, by falling into the trap of cultural relativism, this discourse misses the whole picture. Critiquing religions and poking fun at them are necessary for religious reform and for checking religious and fundamentalist excesses. Certainly, the history of Europe and its established churches at various historical periods testifies to the importance of this function of freedom of expression. Don't forget your history. This presentation had addressed the issue from an angle that is often absent from the discourse of self-restraint and censorship. It has focused on the political function of blasphemy. Many Islamic countries have justified their violation of human rights, women and citizen and minority rights, and they did that using strong culture relativism. By highlighting how blasphemy laws, however, and a cultural relativist approach to religion and culture have been used as tools of oppression by authoritarian regimes, the presentation underscores the importance of freedom of expression for any functioning democracy. Iran may claim that it protects authentic cultural practices and correct religious values. What it claims stands at odds with what it does. Systematically jailing, torturing, and executing dissidents without due process of law, assassinating political opponents outside state borders. What it claims stand at odds with its persecution of the Baha'i minority for simply following a different religious tradition. Iran may claim that it is protecting authentic cultural practices and correct religious values. In reality, it is violating fundamental basic rights of its citizens. The selective use of religion to justify human rights violations is clearly manifested by the way Saudi Arabia uses religious argument as a tool of legitimization for any policy the government deems or chooses to follow. For decades, it insisted that Islamic teaching prohibits women and girls from participating in sport. When it decided to give women and girls this right, those teachings miraculously changed with the citing of a religious edict by a dead mufti. By the same token, Saudi Arabia has been notorious in its invoking of religion to silence any political criticism of its authoritarian or theocratic style of governance. The apostasy case mentioned in against Raif Badawi is a famous example, and it highlights a strategy of the Saudi authorities to accuse any critique, any person criticizing its style of governance, or in the case of Raif Badawi, the excesses of the religious authority as a way to legitimize him or her. Islamic countries are not unique in their use of cultural relativism to get away with their violation of human rights, and I mentioned how colonial powers used to do that as well in the past. Whether the approach is used by Islamic states or colonial states, the objective is one. Applying international standards of human rights would undermine their grip on power. Preserving power has been the core of the matter. So the politics of survival of Islamic regimes highlight this clearly. And those using this strategy, the political leaders and the regimes, they only seek to overcome their lack of legitimacy by using what I called the Islamist card. They take advantage of the phenomena of political and societal Islamism, endorse certain Islamist groups rather than others, and forge political alliances with them. And while this alliance is Machiavellian in nature, from the perspective of these leaders, elites, and regime, it necessitates mainstreaming the religious dogmas of these Islamist movements and implementing their interpretation. And very often, this interpretation leads to the imposition of draconian blasphemy laws. They are tools of oppression. Tools of oppression. It is this dimension that should be considered by the discourse of culture relativism. The problem does not lie in the exercise of freedom of expression, but rather with those who are curtailing it in the name of religion and culture. Thank you.